I wasn't born for silence, but I learned to use it like someone learns a trade. First, there were the linen ribbons, crossed over my chest until my breath forgot the memory of my body. Then, the scissors, the ones my mother used to open the hems of dresses, cutting my hair above my ears. Discarding the locks she called my vanities, finally. A cracked framed mirror leaning against the kitchen wall, where my face, which knew cornbread and Sunday hymns, began to know the weight of a kepi. My name was Sarah Whitaker. At least, that was the name the pastor said when he wet my forehead in the Methodist church, and it was the name my father, Elias, wrote with a steady hand on the post office receipts. However, that summer, when the dust of the road seemed like both prayer and plague at the same time, I began to repeat another name inside my head, Samuel. I called myself Samuel in a whisper, then in a low voice, then in silence again, as if getting used to him was a kind of march step, pause. The decision didn't come in a flash. It was woven slowly, like weaving a basket. First, the news from Pratt Street in Baltimore the previous year, troops from Massachusetts, stones, shots, blood spilled in the middle of the city. Then, my cousin's departure to the blue ranks of the Army of the Potomac, and his quick return, months later, in a wagon, with a leg stiff as a hoe handle. Finally, one late afternoon, with the sun setting behind Catoctin Mountain, my father, sitting on the porch bench, took off his hat and said, "The table has 2 plates and 1 empty, daughter. The country wants the same, more room than we have." I looked at his hands, the hands of a stubborn carpenter, and understood that the house was eating its own bones to stay standing. There were debts to the blacksmith McPherson, to the salt merchant, to the post office itself for the stamps that sent news but never brought payment. The harvest had been capricious, and people were speaking softly in the market and loudly in the barns. Some said Union as if giving a blessing. Others whispered secesh as if cursing without admitting it. In Maryland, the line that cuts the map also cuts through neighbors. "Are you going to tell me it's not a woman's job?" I replied, before he could say it. My father breathed with the patience of someone who knows wood by its smell. "I don't want any woman where bullets decide the hours," he said, without harshness. "But I know that bullets don't ask that. If it must be, may God give you the way and the return." He looked up. "And the name?" I hadn't said it. I didn't need to. "Samuel," I replied, savoring the taste. "Samuel Whitaker." The next day, I hid what I needed to hide in a sack of raw cotton, 2 strips of linen, an old measuring tape to mark my own pace. I thought that, walking like a man, I would have to measure the world. A dull razor. I learned to use soot as a beard in the first few days. A tin mug, a New Testament that I intended to read without anyone noticing, and a picture of my mother. This one I swore to read with my eyes, not with my face. I put on sky blue trousers that a neighbor mended without asking who they were for, a dark blue fatigue blouse that I bought in exchange for 2 crumpled greenbacks, brogans that the farrier sold for less because the soles had already known to many stones. The kepi, tied tightly so it wouldn't fall in my eyes, was the only thing I bought new. I had the foolish hope that a new hat would give me old wisdom. The Susquehanna gleamed gray in the morning as I climbed down from the wagon at the side of the road. The noise I had heard about drums, voices, the insistent blast of reveille was louder up close. Camp Curtin looked like a feverish fair. Tents, lines, wash tubs, a larger tent where a haughty man read instructions like someone setting up a platform for ideas. "Form up. Name? Age? Can you handle a rifle, boy?" I nodded and wore the lie until it felt comfortable. A sergeant with a red beard and a wool shirt looked at me with the eyes of a shopkeeper. "Name? Samuel Whitaker." He wrote without lifting his pen. "Where from?" "Frederick County, Maryland." He raised his head slightly, not out of suspicion, out of habit. "How old?" 20, I replied, and my voice dropped half a tone as I had practiced in front of the cracked mirror. "Very well, Samuel. You'll learn what 15 movements do to a man." He tapped the little blue-covered book, Hardy's Tactics. His name was Hennessy, I found out later. An Irishman with a domesticated accent, he knew the distance between step off and stand fast with the familiarity my father knew the difference between a ripe peach and a spoiled peach. Hennessy placed a Springfield 1861 in my hands. Wood that breathes, metal that has a will of its own. By the end of the week, this will seem like an extension of your arm, and your arm an extension of your mind. The shelter halves, 2 halves of canvas that turn into. They smelled of dog tent, they smelled of old rain. The settler, with his tent of miracles and debts, sold me ground coffee, tobacco I didn't use, a curved needle and wax thread for mending the impossible. I bought a short pencil because I wanted to write without wasting the words of the New Testament. I paid in tokens and shame. I knew I was promising future money that might never come. In the camp, expense walks alongside every step, and the bill arrives at the rhythm of taps. Let's see if the uniform fits you. Boy, Hennessy watched me put on the fatigue blouse. The armpit seam seemed to beg for more space. Men have arms that the seam respects. I adjusted the belt with the oval US buckle, the black cartridge box on the side, the cap pouch for the percussion caps, the haversack on my shoulder, the tin canteen hanging and clanking like a clock. I learned to open the cartridge box with my thumb, bite the paper cartridge, pour out the powder, seat the mini ball, ram it down with the ramrod, cock the hammer, place the percussion cap. 15 movements, the sergeant repeated. And then the silent movements, the eyes that measure the wind, the stomach that learns to wait, the tongue that unlearns how to say certain things. Which side of the line? A young man beside me asked, while the sutler measured coffee into tin cups. Maryland, I replied. He laughed with his eyes. That's a side and it's a mirror. His name was Ephraim Doyle. But someone nicknamed him Puck after a rainy day when he pulled a joke from somewhere that made half the platoon remember their living room at home. He chewed nothing. When the nothing ran out, he chewed a memory. Puck didn't suspect me. He was suspicious of everything: the clouds, the officers, the price of coffee. A tea night. The gum blanket of varnished canvas separated my body from the mud like a verse separates faith from fury. The fire licked the mugs, and the coffee boiled water with the promise of courage turned the camp into a parish without pews. Someone started singing Battle Cry of Freedom softly, and another joined in with a bass line that was just off-key enough to sound human. I thought about my woman's voice, which needed to remember to be a man's voice when someone shouted, "Form up." I also thought that courage, if it has a gender, shouldn't obey names. The dawn brought the bugle call with the cold reveille. The roll call hastily called out names and counted destinies without knowing them. When I heard Whitaker, Samuel, my mouth answered here, with the firmness of someone accepting a sentence and a legacy. I used sir without fear, yes, sergeant without anger, and no, sergeant only when it was indispensable. In a week, my fingers had new calluses, places where the artillery rope didn't bite, where the leather strap didn't burn, where the rifle stock recognized its owner. The first Sunday at Camp Curtin was the closest thing to home I would experience for a while. The chaplain preached about names. He said that God's names are many, and ours only one, and that heaven is accustomed to calling us by what we do when no one sees. I closed my eyes and asked for a specific boldness, not to be a scandal. I didn't want to become a song, or a story whispered in a tent. I wanted to fulfill what the uniform demanded, and when the time came, return the uniform with everything it had lent me. At the end of the afternoon, I went to the edge of the field, where ammunition boxes were lined up under canvas and wagons with wooden wheels. The Susquehanna River flowed in the distance, as if guarding secrets of two banks and liking both. I wrote a short letter to my father, using a hand that wasn't quite my own. Mr. Elias Whitaker, I began, because father hurt too much. I said that the uniform fit, that the rifle was heavy, that the boots were honest. I didn't say that the linen tape tightened more at night. I didn't say that fear has a time to arrive and no time to leave. I said that I was in the service of the Army of the Potomac. I signed Samuel, and in the end, I made an S a little prettier than necessary, a small gesture from someone who still remembers their full name. You learn fast, Whitaker, Hennessy said, on the second day of instruction, when my right face didn't knock the boy next to me over. Just be careful with your voice. Why, Sergeant? Because it gives you away before the bullet does. I lowered my head. Yes, sir. Then he lightly patted my shoulder with the hand that had already patted the shoulders of men who returned and men who stayed behind. Here's the thing. When taps sounds for the first time near you, everyone's voice changes. Camp Curtin had a way of transforming realities into routines. Morning inspection, drill at noon, fatigue duty in the afternoon. The settler cut short the romance of hunger with his price-gouging knives. The provost guard made sure to remind us that freedom, in the army, walks with a rope attached. The boys learned to mend their own brogans. I learned to mend something else, the way I walked. I felt the eyes of others on my steps, and I wanted to walk like someone who knows the map of the street. Firm, but not haughty. Economical, not delicate. I discovered that a man is read by his shoulders. I tried to read mine. On the third day, a lieutenant named Ezra Blake, who spoke more cleanly than a polished boot, lined up the company and recited 15 words that I haven't forgotten. An army is made of equal steps and different decisions. Decide correctly when orders are lacking. The phrase came back to me months later, amidst gunfire. But there it served me as another kind of instruction, that no one would give me the script for every breath. I would always be the one who decides between two truths, mine and the world's. There were small humiliations, and for that very reason, great ones. In the line to receive the wool shirts, the quartermaster looked at my shoulders and chose a size too large. It was wide in the shoulders and short in the cuffs, the worst combination for someone who wants to go unnoticed. I made sure to tie a knot inside the waistband, to roll up my sleeves like someone who wants to work and not like someone who makes a mistaken measurement. On the 5th day, the camp barber, a former shoemaker from York, offered me a razor. "Not today," I replied, and he laughed. "Many don't go at first. Then the army gives them a beard that they have to pay me to shave off." I smeared soot on my face in the late afternoon, just so I wouldn't look too clean where dirt was a badge of honor. Tonight, the boys gambled pieces of hardtack and cigar butts in card games with fewer rules than appeals. I stayed on the edge, my coffee mug in my lap, listening to I Reckon and By pass like birds over the conversation. The smell of leather grease and the warm metal of the Springfield reminded me that soon, theory would turn into muscle. Fear, when it came, didn't burst into the tent with a bang. It entered under the canvas like a cat learning a new house, sniffing everything before choosing where to lie down. On the 6th day, it was my turn to take a message to a smaller camp. On the other side of a worm fence, the note said, "What notes say numbers, places, times?" What mattered to me was the path. The late afternoon sun made the edges of the leaves shine, and the ground had recent wagon wheel tracks. A boy was playing a drum out of time. Perhaps he was new, perhaps it was the only rhythm his mother knew as hope. There was a woman from the Sanitary Commission was hanging clean cloths on makeshift lines between two shelter halves, and the wind carried the scent of soap to me. I inhaled the future I wasn't authorized to have, the hospital tent, what could be cared for, what couldn't be saved. On my return, Hennessy was waiting for me with a look that wasn't one of disapproval. "You brought the pace back," he said. "That's harder than bringing the paper." I wanted to ask if he had ever known anyone like me. I lost my nerve. The stories of others can be a knife. Our own sometimes is just a thread. It was on a moonless night that I heard, from afar, the bugle call that would take many friends and a part of me for years. Taps. It wasn't for anyone I knew yet. Even so, the sound found a place inside my chest and claimed ownership. At the morning's roll call, the sergeant's voice was less sharp. "Mine too. Whitaker, Samuel." "Here," I replied, and I knew, with a certainty that cannot be put into words, that the question, "Who are you?" no longer had just one answer. Days later, the order came with the taste of dust that orders have: march south. The Army of the Potomac would take care of roads. I only knew from the rumors in the newspapers and the lines on the map. Someone said South Mountain with the respect one has for a difficult relative. Another said Antietam and bit the word as if it were bitter. Puck nervously ran his hand over his kepi and whispered, "Have you ever seen a bullet up close, Sam?" I shook my head. "I've seen questions. They say bullets ask fewer questions." He laughed awkwardly and offered me half a piece of hard cornbread. I refused so I could accept something else, the friendship that arrives without asking for a full name. On the last night at Camp Curtin, I sat at the edge of the camp to write another letter. "Mr. Elias Whitaker, Frederick County." I said I was fine as a body can be when it's learned to share a bed with mud, to call coffee food, and to make the rifle a kind of backbone. I didn't ask for a blessing aloud, but I used up the pencil lead on a word I wanted to hear back. "Come back." I said it to myself and to my father at the same time. "I'll come back," before putting things away. I touched, for the first time without guilt, my bandaged chest, not to remember what it hid but to remember what it held. There was courage there, but it was courage that demanded secrecy. There was fear too, and the fear that learns to walk in step with courage is a kind of wisdom. My mother used to say, while mending dresses with her scissors and her patience, that truth and the body carry the same weight when we close them with short stitches. I didn't know if I agreed, but that night, under canvas, I agreed enough to sleep. Near midnight, the wind brought the smell of possible rain. I thought of Catoctin, of the market in Frederick, of the pastor's voice in the hard-bench church, of my father's hands, of my mother's portrait in the parlor. I thought of the Mason-Dixon line drawn by gentlemen who never had to learn to hide anything. I thought of God, and I asked, not for a victory, but for something simpler. Let me do whatever I have to do. And let me do it with respect. The bugle didn't need to sound for me to wake up at the first gray of dawn. I tied the gum blanket to the haversack, tightened the US buckle at my hip, felt the weight of the Springfield settle on my shoulder as if it were a hand. When the column began to move, I confirmed, one last time, my name, Samuel. The Samuel didn't erase the Sarah. It only asked for a little of her light to illuminate another road. The world ahead promised dusty roads, fields with names that would become scars, and a kind of question that a bullet doesn't answer. Who are you? When no one has time to ask. When the forward command came down the line like water finding its course, I went. Not out of bravado, not out of anger, but because of a pact I had made with the table in my house, to bring back, somehow, our daily bread, and if necessary, to bring back my name one or two whole again. The country fit into two things, I thought, as the dust rose, a letter that the postman could deliver, and a fence that we could mend. The rest, God would teach along the way. The march south began with the sound of leather on straps, the metal of buckles marking a purposeful rhythm, and the breath of many transforming the air into a promise. As I passed the last settler's tent, I heard a man selling lemons for more than they were worth for scurvy, he said, as if a pretty name justified an ugly price. Puck nudged me with his elbow. Save what little you have, Sam. Further on, the bill comes without change. A sergeant from another company ended the conversation with two words that fit in any army. March, boys. I marched. And with each step, the Samuel settled in. The Sarah didn't leave. She sat with me in the haversack, my mother's picture at the bottom, wrapped in a scrap of calico, and, faith folded like a letter we don't read completely so it won't end. The Susquehanna was left behind. The dust settled around us, and the rest was left to God. We marched south with our names stitched tighter than our seams. Leather creaked in time with the drum. Brogans learned the pike. And every mile taught my body a new way to remember. Samuel. The Springfield rode my right shoulder like a hand that meant to steady more than it meant to weigh. When the column bent along the river roads, the Susquehanna fell behind with the slow stubbornness of a thing that knows how to wait men out. I kept my place and my breath, and when the sergeant called halts, I learned to sit on my heels like the rest, elbows on knees. Canteen rocking against the belt as if it could keep time for a heart to quick for orders. South Mountain stood up ahead like a decision. Fox's Gap, Turner's Gap, Crampton's Gap, names I heard in the mouths of men who said them as if they had chewed those rocks before. We passed through Frederick with the columns strung from street to street. Porches held faces made of both prayers and accounting sum, raised handkerchiefs and called God bless the Army of the Potomac. Some kept their mouths pressed as if we were taking something we couldn't pay for. Mrs. Bottler, though, I would have known her by the set of her jaw, from 100 yards. Whether or not she'd tied black ribbon on her door, stood with arms folded and watched our line go by. I did not look for my father. I looked for everything that felt like home and allowed it to be a street I could not step out of. The smell of boiled apples drifted from a bakery. A boy beat a drum to streets to fast. A woman reached up with a dipper and poured water into the mouths of men who did not break step to thank her. In that 1 hour, Frederick was a country, and we passed through it like a river that had been told it couldn't stop. We hit the mountain when the day had worn itself to a thin edge. The road pitched up, and gravel talked under the soles. Fox's Gap took our breath and asked for more. The color guard carried the flag as a man carries a coal in a windy night, tight, certain. We went from drill to instinct to drill again, with no time to admire the order inside that. Artillery rattled the air from one gap to another and came back to us twice as loud, like voices calling down a staircase. You could smell the iron before you could see the men. Who would be the reason for it? I learned that day that a fence already knows how to be brave. We lay behind rails stacked in worm pattern and timed our world to the voice of the sergeants. Load, bite, pour, seat, ram, cap, aim, fire. I caught the motion in my hands even when my head could not catch it. Hennessy slid along our line as if the ground had been made to fit him. Steady, he said the way he had always said it, like a man who'd lived 1 month longer than any given day and knew how to loan that month to others. Puck crouched so low his chin nearly learned to button his jacket. then stood as if something had reminded him there was sky, and he hadn't paid it much attention. "You see this?" he whispered, eyes bright and dark at once. "This is why coffee should be free." When the order came, we moved up around rock that imagined itself into walls. We were not asked for anything. The mountain did not also demand. And that is why we obeyed: arms, backs, knees, toes, necks, breath in and breath out. The first shot I did not remember hearing. The second I remembered not wanting to. After that it was the language. The wind carried powder and dirt and the astonishing sour sweetness of a crushed grape someone had carried from home and had not finished eating at the wrong time. I saw the top of a hat slouch disappear and saw a hand rise without it, and then another man reach and grab the wrist and put it down. We kept our rails. We took a little ground. We gave it back. We took it again. And the light turned copper along the ridge before somebody told it to. Someone, perhaps a Maryland boy wearing gray. Perhaps a Virginian sang half a line of a hymn the Dunkers would have known. And then the mountain swallowed it and handed us another hour of work instead. We didn't break that day. Nor did we turn the mountain into a story that wanted telling. We lived through a thing, and then we sat down where we were told to wait for the next thing. After sundown the dead were the quietest men alive, and the rest of us did what we could with water and cloth. I took a canteen mine and ran in a line that had not been drawn but was understood. The first mouth wanted 2 swallows and a secret. The second wanted 3 and a promise. The third wanted a name. I did not ask for it. I gave friend, the same a German farmer would later say in another place, and found that the word can soften a jaw the way a towel softens a stone. Back. Behind a hedge a surgeon bent over a boy whose foot had decided not to go any farther without him. The saw sang in a corner of the tent where it thought we couldn't hear. He did what he had to do, which is the same any of us did that day. Sanitary Commission women moved with baskets and cups. One of them carried stitches, already tied around needles, and moved through men with a "Look that," said her husband may have refused to sit down when he was told, and she had loved him for it, and cursed him for it, and learned to do both things in the time it takes to boil a kettle. That night taps came, down the mountain and into my chest. The first time it found me, I had been standing up, trying to make my feet understand that a blister wasn't a moral problem. This time I sat on the ground at the edge of a field where the last daylight had resigned. It took the air and breathed it back to me as if it had always belonged to someone else. Hennessy dropped down beside me without asking if I was company. He didn't say "You did well." He didn't say "You'll sleep." He said, "This is when names move." I kept my mouth shut and let him keep his. Puck came and leaned against my shoulder like a cousin, and asked if we had any sugar left. We didn't. He laughed anyway. He had the kind of luck that counts sugarless coffee as a step toward heaven. We came off the mountain and steps the ground allowed. Keedysville, Boonesboro, Middletown Valley, places I had lived near in a life that now looked at me from across a room and measured whether I belonged back in it. Then we took the road to a creek a man had decided to call by its proper name, Antietam, and the men in charge decided to ask it a question with a whole army. The farmsteads that watched us come had German names: Piper, Roulette, Miller, and the church by the corn had the clean white face of Dunkers who mean to wash anything that needs it, even if it's a whole congregation's pride. We slept the night before in a book that had not yet had its page turned to the place where our lines were written. Dew got in the seams of our blankets, and the smell of cattle made it into our dreams. I wrote a note by lantern stub to Mr. Elias Whitaker and told him we were by a creek and a bridge and some corn in that. Should he read the papers and find a name he recognized among the numbers, he ought to remember the boy he didn't have and the daughter he did and count them both once. Antietam woke with purpose the way some men do who are not quite sure they deserve the day and try to outrun that question. The cornfield went black at noon. We learned an hour can swallow itself whole. We were sent forward and back and sideways until the compass forgot itself and asked for new letters to write truth. The Dunker church gathered smoke like a shawl. Out by the sunken road, Bloody Lane, it would be called before sunset, because words must be found even for things that shouldn't need them, some men insisted. The ground would be theirs, and other men insisted the ground could not be anyone's. And that's how both groups came to call it a road again. My work came the way it had on the mountain, but more of it. Lieutenant Ezra Blake, clean-spoken, boots dirtier than his vowels, shoved 2 cartridge boxes into my arms and said to each company, "Forward of the fence now," and what marked me did not mark me. My run broke into a crouch, and then into a crawl, and then back to something that a child would have recognized as a walk if the child had ever been asked to do it, while men threw iron in the air. A man behind me shouted, "Samuel." And I did not answer until I was where answering would not pull anyone's eyes the wrong direction. H Company's sergeant took the boxes and put a hand on my shoulder and shoved me back down the way I had come, and that was thanks enough. Water was money. I spent mine wisely. I found Puck with a hole in his sleeve that looked like a warning and nothing worse. He tried a joke about sleeves and mothers, and the Lord supplying a needle wherever he put forward a thread. I laughed because laughter is a kind of loyalty. We went out again because the day was not done spending a by afternoon. The world had ripped the same bedsheet so many times that the strip we had left could barely wrap what needed wrapping. Near the roulette farm, the barn filled itself with breathing and less than breathing. The Sanitary Commission hung vinegar air from the rafters. A Christian commission man read from a pocket testament and then whispered a letter from the lips of a boy with his eyes closed, who called his mother ma'am and asked me to spell it that way. I obeyed. Heat does what powder cannot. It finds your water and taxes it. I did not know I was shaking until my hands made it obvious to a man, holding a tray of bandages, who frowned long enough to be human, and then called to an orderly to cut a slit in a canteen so I could sip through a rag and not drown when swallowing turned into work. "Corporal," the orderly yelled to a man I could not see, "this one's heat, not shot," which was a mercy, until it wasn't. They moved me behind the canvas where a physician stood in a circle of lamplight that made him look like God had made a small mistake and asked him to fix it. He did not have time for new mistakes, so he worked with the old ones. He put his hand to my forehead and then to my wrist. "Name?" he asked, as if he needed to look me in the eye when I said it. "Whitaker, Samuel." "Strip," he said, and there was no malice in it. Only the economy of a man who can count the number of minutes he has left in other people's lives. I coughed and made my voice a place someone could lose his way in. "No shot, sir," I said. "Heat, tight chest, weak knees, better with water." He reached toward the collar. My fingers found the buttons before his did. "Let me," I said, and one eye told me he noticed my courtesy and that it was not the kind he could picture on a battlefield. He put his hand on my shoulder, as one man does for another when both have agreed to a version of flattery. "Deep breath," he said. I did so and made it hurt the way a wound might hurt. That. He listened through the cloth where it gave sound, and then moved back and did mental sums, while 3 more men were set on cots. "Laudanum if you want it," he said. I shook my head. "Water then. And get him out of this heat." Hennessy, who had slipped in at a pin's head of time, put his palm to the small of my back like he had permission. I knew I had not given him, and steered me to a place where I could sit as a man sits when he is not sick, but is done pretending he is well. The worst bullet that day was a question. It does not whistle, and you cannot see the smoke where it came from, and still it knocks you off your feet. Who are you? Are you what you say or what your shirt says? Are you what a man calls you when he wants to save time? Are you what the ground will call you when it has reason to take you in? I held a cup with both hands until the tremor learned which one of us was boss. When Hennessy came back from actually doing something, he looked at my face and did not look again. He handed me a plug of tobacco I would never use. It is a gesture the army was made to do, and I did my part of it. I put the thing in my haversack and did not lose it. Near early evening, a courier came up the lane, licking dust off his upper lip like a man trying to taste the rain. He shouted news to someone, and that news, like most such news, tried to sound like it had been meant from the beginning. My boots did not care, and the men who had given up their boots also did not care. The creek kept running where it had run before. We taught it our names. The cornfield had turned into something that would be told about even when men had decided to say they did not want to talk about it. At the sunken road, the air finally agreed to stop being a voice and became a throat again. After the work, I found a piece of fence and wrote another letter. The words you can send home from a day like that do not look much like the day. Mr. Elias Whitaker, I put at the top, respectful to a fault. I am whole. I lied politely. I am emptier in certain corners. I told a kind of truth. We were by a creek called Antietam. If anyone asks you to be proud or ashamed, ask him first if he can bring your daughter a loaf of bread. I signed Samuel with a hand that remembered the curve of an S it had learned to make. Pretty in a house with a parlor. Puck slept with his jaw open and his hand on the tin cup, as if someone might Come and try to take away the right to drink. He muttered, "Ma'am," and whether he was speaking to a mother or a woman from the Sanitary Commission I could not tell. Lieutenant Blake sat and took his boot off and examined the blister on his heel as carefully as he had reckoned the range that morning. He said nothing and then said, "Well," which is a word that can mean gratitude or surrender or the sheer power of a man deciding to be a man again the next day. Hennessy walked the line of sleeping and near sleeping, and put his hand on the shoulder of each man who would still be there in the morning, and said the same word for all of them. "Steady." I fell under as a man falls into a river he has decided will not drown him. I dreamed of a porch and the way light makes the dust honest when it comes through a window. I dreamed of a table with 2 plates and a place where a plate should go. I dreamed of my own name, and woke with Samuel in my mouth and Sarah in my bones, and neither was wrong. The bugle did not wait for me to ask for more. It roused whoever could be roused. And the work of counting, stacking, writing, carrying, and thinking afterward began with the same sound as any other day, men clearing their throats. In the days that followed, I came to know the peculiar quiet of places that have had questions answered. Antietam Creek ran on. The Miller cornfield learned to grow again. The Dunker church stood white and unashamed. We learned to write numbers we did not want. And someone wiser than me began the work of sending names back to the kitchens, where names are supposed to do their duty best. In a field just east of town, German farmers started putting the ground back where men had taken it apart. A man in a felt hat took it off his head for everyone he put under, whether their buttons said US or not. He called each friend and the word was so clean I wanted to drink it. We pulled back toward the roads where food and orders live. On the way, a wagon from the Christian Commission caught up with us and handed out tracts and chalk. I took the chalk. I wrote W inside my left brogan where the lining would rub it away in a week. That is what men do when they need to prove to themselves that something belongs. I wrote again to Mr. Elias, slower now. If you hear that our column passed near Frederick, I put, do not come to the road. If you see a line of blue or gray and think you recognize my shoulder in it, sit down and let that thought go by. If God is merciful, He will keep me from walking past your porch in a uniform you can see through. South Mountain was behind, Antietam behind, and a winter in front that promised its own work. The Army's talk turned to Fredericksburg and to bridges and to whether a town that had married itself to a river could be asked to get a divorce. I learned what a man learns the second month of a war, that the first month is free, and the rest you pay for every day. I learned to treat the binding around my chest as something that had been stitched there at birth. Learned to cough with conviction and say sir with a voice you wouldn't want a boy to mimic in church. Learned to shave a patch of air if anyone watched too close. The question bullet kept flying without sound. Who are you? It asked at the coffee fire, at evening prayer, at the latrine ditch. At the edge of a hospital tent where a surgeon did not have time to notice what he had almost noticed, the camp fell into a rhythm too big for any one man. Dog tents snored. Gum blankets beaded. Hardtack got soft at the edges where the damp made it honest. We lined up for inspection and for pay we had already promised to the settler. We played cards we swore were not worth the hours, and then looked up when the provost guard walked by, as if we had never seen cards before. We sang Lorena, because it refuses men and women equally and gives both back their evenings. The hills became ears. They listened to our talk and kept it even when we forgot what we said. I wrote one last letter from the Maryland side before we turned our bodies toward Virginia. Pa, I wrote and I crossed it out and put Mr. Elias. They gave us a new pair of socks and a sermon. The socks will do their job, and so will the sermon. If the roads hold, I will march on them. If they don't, I will carry them a piece and hope someone else takes them the rest of the way. Your daughter is a good boy. I left that last line and then under it, I put your son is a good man. I folded the two truths into the same paper and gave it to a post rider who did not want to know any more than he had to. When I closed my eyes that night, the air tasted of wood smoke and rain and something else I couldn't name that I decided to call promise. Hennessy walked past and tapped the toe of my brogan with his stick the way a father knocks a half-closed door to remind a child that the house still has rules. First smoke behind us, he said, not asking me to answer. Plenty more ahead. I rolled to my side and put a hand on the haversack where my mother's photograph lay, wrapped in a square of calico. And let the weight of the Springfield at my elbow be the stone that holds a letter down in a wind. Morning would come and find our uniforms smelling exactly the way they deserved. The Army would take up the procession of verbs. It prefers march. dig, load, fire, hold, refuse, withdraw, return, and the names would move over us again like a prayer said for a child who does not yet believe. Somewhere far from us, a man was writing a telegram that would make a bridge a different thing. Somewhere close to us, a boy was learning to boil coffee without choking the taste out of it. Somewhere in a house in Frederick County, a man sat at a table with a black cloth tied round his arm and did the work of not asking the road for news. I learned to do the one thing a soldier can be praised for and faulted for in the same hour. I learned to keep my place. The first smoke had taught us how to breathe it. The next would teach us something about winter, and another after that about shadows, and the long summer after that, about what a bullet can do when it chooses a name it has no right to pronounce. For now, I put my face toward the south and waited for the drum to stand up and tell the sun what we had decided to do with its light. The river froze in the mornings along its edges, a lace of ice that pretended at beauty, while men counted bridges that had not yet arrived. We reached Falmouth in early December, with the Rappahannock between us and Fredericksburg, the town sitting on its hill with brick cheeks and a stone jaw. The talk along the line used the same few names, like a deck-worn soft, Burnside, Pontoons, Mary's Heights. The men who said the words did not say them as orders. They said them as weather. On the 11th, the fog lay down on the water and refused to move. The engineers brought the pontoon trains up at last, white canvas bulging like bellies. And we stood on Stafford Heights and watched men wrestle timbers where a current argued louder than any officer would dare. Skirmish fire trickled across from the town sharp, nagging, like a neighbor who knows you don't want to answer the door, and then sharpened, window by window. A regiment went down to act as if pipes and pins could be set in peace. Confederate rifles said otherwise. The first boats shoved off with infantry crouched low. O'Rourke licking a cracked lip and saying, "That'll make the papers." He was right. But no paper would print the smell of wet wood and the way a man can taste river in his teeth. Message. Whitaker, Lieutenant Ezra Blake said, and put a folded note in my hand. To Captain Winslow, Lower Bridge, then back to me. No dawdling. He didn't smile. There wasn't time for it. I tucked the paper beneath my fatigue blouse, under the tape binding my chest, where a name beat that no one had asked me to repeat. We ran down the frozen slope. It crunched under broken soles and slid into a place where the bridge looked like a rough line of tables waiting for a supper that would never be eaten. The air did not know if it was day or night. Smoke had told the light to sit down. Men crouched behind abutments and pulled their caps low, and then stood up when the bridge needed a board more than a man needed caution. I stepped onto the first pontoon and felt it answer me in a way no ground ever had. I crossed with my chin pulled in toward my collarbone and my hands too busy to look like they were shaking. The water below was not interested in whether I lived. It had other errands. On the far side, I found a captain with a face I would have liked in a pastor, and gave him a strip of words that were not mine. He tore the paper open with his thumb and said, "Of course," which no one ever says when something new is proposed. He pointed me back the way I had come, and I went. By afternoon we were across in numbers, and the town learned what it is to be between two armies that have run out of patience. The engineers laid more bridges. Like a man sets a row of teeth into a mouth, he has to teach to bite. Street by street the fog lifted, and Fredericksburg revealed brick and clapboard and a string of chimneys that had felt less useful yesterday. A house on Caroline Street gave us a view of its insides through a window that had not intended to be treated that way. From a parlor, a word that always means mother to me, we fired into a street where men we would never know answered from behind a barrel and between the doors. Puck tried to make a remark about being invited in for tea. He failed and laughed anyway. "Keep your line," Hennessy said, and our line learned to move along a hallway. To step over a toppled chair without becoming a man who had not been taught manners. When night put its hand on the town, the sound did not go with it. Groans lay out there in the dark where the open ground began below the heights. Men had made charges at a stone wall that a careful road had dropped itself into, and Mary's Heights had proved that a stone can be a soldier when men insist on advancing one way only. The wall in the lane behind it taught a lesson the way an unkind schoolmaster would, with certainty and repetition. Units went out and came back numbered differently. By the time the last charge fell, the words "don't send them" had been said in enough voices to earn the right to be called a prayer. We slept in the town and in the houses we would never own. I lay on a parlor carpet and put my palm against the nap to feel the pattern as if it were a map. On a mantel, A clock ticked until it coughed itself out, springs broken by sound that had not been designed into the day. I set my tin cup down where a lady had once put a vase. I asked her forgiveness in silence for drinking where she had displayed beauty. Puck snored and then called his ma'am, and I wondered if he had one letter left that could be sent, with news that would not break a plate. Morning showed the ground below the heights in a thin gray that had nothing to do with fog. The wounded had called all night. A rumor ran along the line that a South Carolinian had gone over the wall with canteens and water and had been allowed by both sides to do so until someone remembered what it meant to be a man above being a soldier. Whether it happened or whether we needed it to be true, it eased something that had tightened in me all night. I wanted to go out, but Hennessy's hand on my sleeve was iron. Orders, he said. Steady, he added, and both words were true irritants on the same day. On the river bank, the Lacey House, Chatham Manor, was already a hospital. White sheets hung from its windows like flags of surrender, but nothing in there was surrender. It was work. Men on doorways moved by twos and threes, carrying what could be carried. Sawdust covered a floor that had been designed for dancing and politeness. I carried messages for a morning, to a battery that needed more shell, to a colonel whose voice had gone hoarse and who needed someone else's to read his orders, to a nurse who had promised herself she would forbid whiskey and allow coffee, and then put her hand on a man's cheek and broke both rules at a stroke. I did not intend to go behind the screen. Nobody intends to go behind the screen. A surgeon stood with his hands in water that was not the same color it had been in the pail. He looked at me and then through me and then back at me long enough to say, "Hold this," and put the end of a bandage in my fingers. I did as I was told and counted without meaning to 14 turns, one knot, a breath. The way a man's chest finds a slower beat when someone else says his name. By afternoon I could feel heat in my skin, not fever yet, but the warning of it. I had drunk more coffee than water, and the coffee had been cooked to death twice, and resuscitated with grounds no one had had the heart to throw away. The room ebbed. I backed into air. The walk from porches to street was a climb. Hennessy found me sitting on the second step of a ruined stoop and said, "You do not breathe like a man who has taken a bullet." He took me to an alley where the wind could find me and keep me. "If you faint, faint like a soldier," he said, and I laughed, because he could say a thing like that without wondering if it had more than one meaning. Name? A hospital clerk asked. Whitaker Samuel. He wrote it and did not look up. A surgeon with eyes like a man who has been woken every hour for a month pulled my collar aside to see if a pulse in a neck could be counted better than a pulse at a wrist. He moved his hand to my chest. My fingers were quicker. "Let me," I said, as if the cloth were more decency than cloth ever gets to be. He let me. He watched my breath move where he thought fabric should move, and then stepped away and did not force anything. That would have been a different kind of wound. "Laudanum?" he asked. "No, sir," I said, because I needed my wits more than I needed my pain to be quiet. He grunted without humor. "Water then, and sleep. That is worth something." He looked at Hennessy. "This one goes outside, into air. Don't lose him." He said him because that was the cheapest way to keep time. We pulled back to Stafford Heights by the 15th. The town was left to its damage and to the men the army could not lift on short notice. We set up tents where frost drew its lace, and then withdrew it at noon. The army began to speak in winter words. Corduroy roads, hut, Sibley, picket, ration, payroll. Settlers shook their boxes of brass tokens like gamblers. The provost guard paced like they owned the notion of lines. Burnside's face looked older wherever I saw it. He ordered a move in January, when rain intended to rule. We slid along red Virginia mud that covered a man past his ankles and then reached up to take his humor from him. They called it the Mud March, because no one wanted to say the harder truth, that a whole army had bogged down in a single county, because someone had decided to argue with God about weather. We built huts at Falmouth, log by log, with a roof of shelter halves and a chimney, dangerous in any wind. Men who had not known a saw better than they knew a prayer invented both new strengths and new injuries. I learned to swing an axe by watching O'Rourke, who had grown up with a handle in his grip as often as a book, and I made my cuts clean enough to be useful. We scavenged boards from fences whose owners would curse us in spring. We set bunks on stakes and stuffed them with straw, and tried to make a thing that mice would not claim entirely as theirs. We named our street without being asked, Baltimore Pike in jest, because all roads have to lead somewhere. In winter, suspicions began, as they always do in cold weather. Remarks that needed warmth to thrive. A boy from New York said, "Sam, you don't grow much of a beard." I rubbed a palm over my jaw and made a sound like a man who had lost a wager against his face. "Give it time," I said, and stretched a match over lamp smoke later so the soot would prove what stubble could not. Puck watched me and said nothing until he said, "You are careful." I lifted an eyebrow. "Careful men live," he said, and left it there. I did not know if he knew. I knew only that he had learned when to leave a thing that had not yet asked him to wrap it in words. The camp held inspections that required more than a rifle and a shoe brush. A medical officer came through with a list and a pen. "Open your shirts," he ordered in a tent crowded with breath. Hennessy had us outside with our belts missing a hole and our shirt buttons changed 3 places over before the officer reached our company. "Gentlemen," Hennessy said, with a strange politeness resting entirely on will, "my men are on fatigue and picket this week, and you will not find them undressed in any reasonable weather, unless the general personally requests it." The officer measured whether his day was better spent arguing or inspecting the next company. He moved on. Hennessy rubbed the bridge of his nose and asked me for my canteen, then took a drink he didn't need and returned it as if he had always meant to. I came down with a cough in January, the kind that winter lends and then refuses to take back neatly. "Samuel's got the catarrh," Puck announced, as if naming it would politely send it from the tent. I kept to my bunk until Ezra Blake needed a runner and found me a Prite. "You're my best legs," he said. "Take this to the quarter guard, and for God's sake don't breath into the paper." I went and held my breath twice and pretended I had decided to quit being sick for an hour. T night, when the wind cut through seams and corners, I wrote letters for men who could only talk. Tell my wife I got her pie and I shared it because that is truly what a good Christian man has to do. One dictated, then looked at me, very serious. "Right, I didn't share it." I obeyed. Another held a locket with hair he had stolen from a child the last morning he could. He dictated slowly, as if the words cost coins. "If you see Mr. Rogers in Falmouth, tell him to send the boots I paid for, or else the Lord will inform him my foot chose to walk elsewhere." "You want me to write that?" I asked. "The Lord part," he said. "Maybe not." I wrote for Puck once, a letter addressed to ma'am with no surname, which is a thing that the mail can sometimes find better than we have a right to expect. "Tell her," he said, blinking furiously at a candle, "that the coffee is a holy thing, and the Lord loves the Army of the Potomac more when we have it." I wrote that precisely because some things deserve to be exact. A woman from the Sanitary Commission, Lydia Parker, with the apron I had seen even at the Lacey house, set up a tent, where she washed shirts and folded bandages, and told men to hand her their pride if it had turned into something that could be laundered. She gave me tea one day when she caught me sitting on a stump outside our hut, making a business out of breathing through a cold chest. "You haven't got whiskey?" she asked, not offering it. "No, ma'am," I said. "I haven't got a taste for it." "Good," she said. "Whiskey is a sorry bedfellow in cold weather. It will lie to you all night." She asked my name and I gave the one that could be paid for. She nodded as if she had asked the wind whether it intended to blow hard, and had been given something like an answer. In February the wind shifted a little, the ground still iron, and Burnside left. The Army got a new General Hooker, a man who liked to talk to his men and who knew that a blanket can be as much morale as an order. Rations improved. The settler pegged his prices higher. "He'll be the death of us," Puck opined of the settler, then added, "or the coffee, just to be fair." Hennessy had us drill with a briskness that suggested he believed in men and wasn't sure about any general. "Your musket is your mother," he said once, then frowned. "That is a figure that reads strange," he admitted. "Keep it clean." We kept it clean. We marched in place when we could not march anywhere else. The question bullet kept coming at its own speed and without smoke. In the latrine ditch, in the line for beans, in the quartermaster's complaint book, in the tent when I fell asleep with my coat still on and my boots half unlaced. Who are you when no one's looking? Who are you when everyone is? Who are you when the doctor could write something down that would take away the one thing you know how to do in the dark? I bound my chest again at dawn and cut the cloth shorter by a finger's width because I had learned something about breathing and about how a day can use most of a lung and leave enough for a night. I blackened my jaw. Around the same time I blackened the hook that held my cup so that it would not shine in the morning and draw a sergeant's eye. I learned to swear the way a man from Maryland swears, slack on vowels, hard on consonants. A way of saying anger that a father might still allow at a table once a month, Hennessy called me aside once on a day when the wind had forgotten how to be sharp and was merely insistent. He pretended to tie his boot and said, to the leather, I had a drummer once, in Mexico, who ran powders like a rabbit runs a fence clever. He wore a cap and a grin, and not much else on his head. A surgeon called him something once when he fainted. I heard it. I didn't hear it again. He looked up. That boy saved me from having to reload. I do not put a name to what saved me. I salute it. He stood. You will do your job, he said. You will sleep. You will eat. You will not take on what a man offers to carry for you. He walked away and left me and the question to look at each other without an audience for once, on picket along the river one night. The town lights on the far bank sat like stars that had slipped and never been put back. A voice drifted across from the other side, a song I knew from the church where the Dunkers liked to deny ornament. We answered with a hymn I had been taught by a woman who never denied beauty. For 5 minutes we spoke in notes, and the river decided it did not mind carrying news back and forth if it sounded like that. The sentry next to me had a cough that could have been a prayer or could have been his last wish. You hear that? He asked when the songs ended. I reckon, I said. I reckon too, he said, and we kept watch while the world forgot to be at war for a very small space. From a ridge we could see the camps laid out like thoughts in a man's head when he is trying to be orderly. Somewhere Hooker drew lines where other generals had drawn circles, and told corps to learn their names again. Men got furloughs and went home and came back with pies and eyes that couldn't decide whether to be older or younger. Puck received a small box with a gingerbread cake inside and what he called paper kisses stuck to the top, the places where someone had pressed lips to a thing it was safe to send. He cut the cake into 5, and then cut one of the pieces in half for me, and then decided he had to cut the other 3 in half as well, because fairness is a disease in winter that can kill you or save you. I wrote to Mr. Elias and took a risk, small perhaps but my sort. I am well. I lied in the polite way again. The winter is tiresome, and the coffee freshens it, I added, not knowing if I dared. If there is a woman in your house, tell her to put a loaf into the oven even if no one calls one may. If there is no woman, put the loaf in yourself. I signed Samuel, and below it I scratched an S a little finer than the paper demanded and folded it so the crease would run across my name and hold it. The way most things a man owns are held in winter not by locks, but by how neatly they are tucked. When the thaw finally came, it came as a violence. The roads lifted themselves and dropped us where they liked. The Rappahannock shrugged off its lace. Orders picked up in a way that made men look toward the spring woods as if the trees had been listening this whole time, and had, at last, learned our language. Chancellorsville, someone said, and men who had learned to suspect both doom and hope in single syllables checked their cartridge boxes and counted without numbers. Puck asked me if I had a fresh pair of socks. I did. I gave him one of mine. Your mother didn't teach you to share socks, he said. She taught me the hard part first, I said. Share the coffee. On the night before we pulled our huts down and rolled our gum blankets and pretended every log had not been cut and carried by our own hands, taps blew across our street, and I did not think of death. I thought of beginning. I lay in my bunk and bound my chest again, because that is how I begin. The distant howl of some hound in the woods announced a fox had gone where it always goes when men forget to watch. I slept on my left side with my right hand on the butt of the Springfield, because the day does not tell you which shoulder it will ask for until it has already called roll. The question bullet had not stopped. It never will. All I had learned to do was answer it in motion. Who are you? It asked. A soldier, I answered, because there was work to be done and I had breath for it yet. The woods woke up before the army did. Dogwood flared white in the gloom, like lamps someone had meant to light more slowly, and the whip-poor-will sawed its name against the bark while we rolled our gum blankets and shook the straw out of winter. Hooker had given us better rations and cleaner camps through the cold months, and men said his name as if it might finally be the one that stuck. When orders came at the end of April, they came in a rush, as if spring had been waiting for a drum to tell it how to bloom. Cross at Kelly's Ford and United States Ford, move fast, leave the winter behind. We will turn his flank, someone said, and whether he meant Lee's or the Lord's was a thing the mud would decide. We found ourselves in a country that was not a country but a thicket, the wilderness. A place where second-growth scrub, oak and pine ate the light before noon, and where a map made up for breakfast. Roads had the plain names of a man who did not like adjectives: Orange, Turnpike, Orange Plank Road. The Chancellor House sat at the crossroads. 2 stories of brick with a porch that would have liked to be thought of for its lemonade and not for its headquarters. The ground was sand and leaves, and the ghosts of old charcoal pits. "It burns," O'Rourke warned, pinching ash between thumb and forefinger and letting it drift to show us. Remember that when the day wants to be night. Hooker's confidence was a weather of its own, warm, insistent, a little reckless. He told us we were the finest army on the planet, and for a breath we believed him. He told us we were going to whip Bobby Lee, and for a breath we believed that too. Then the thickets took our attention, and made us into smaller men because we could only see as far as the next step needed. Hennessy slotted us where the 2 corps was told to be near Fairview and the high ground east of the Chancellor. Clearing then sent me running before the ground could memorize my shape, to Captain Winslow's battery at Fairview. "Counter march on my mark. If you hear fire from the right," Lieutenant Ezra Blake said, neat as ever. "Don't go by the map, go by the sound." That was a Chancellorsville lesson, where the maps lie. The air tells the truth. We dug rifle pits with whatever the Army calls a shovel when the quartermaster is late, and a frying pan will have to do. We filled our cartridge boxes and checked cap pouches and counted the sugar in our haversacks like money. The woods smelled of warm needles and last year's ash. The air had the taste of something waiting to be smoked. On May 1st the lines advanced and then were called back. Men said the roads were bad. Men said Lee had moved. Men said Hooker had changed his mind. Ezra accepted the kind of frustration that looks clean on a man like him. He folded his orders and unfolded them again, and in between you could hear a crack in the confidence around the house. "It will be well," he said without asking if his voice believed him. A lieutenant's work is to ask his voice to do as it's told. On the afternoon of May 2nd, the air felt as if it had learned something it was not ready to say out loud. Pickets on the Orange Turnpike reported columns moving west to east, south to north, dust lines through thicket, voices in a language the leaves speak when boots argue through them. "It is a retreat," some said. Others craned their heads like hounds at the first hint of a trail. I stood on picket with Puck, who had learned to keep his jokes for when the world had earned them. "You hear that?" he murmured. "It sounds like the Lord is dragging his robe through the brush." He wasn't wrong. News runs even when men won't. It got to us just after sundown. Jackson had taken a course down a hidden road and had gone around our right. A few minutes later, the sound came, the kind that goes through a man before his ears catch up. Yelling, yes, but not the kind men do when they've had time to decide about it. The kind a whole forest makes when it is startled into being acquired. It hit the she-course first. We could not see it. We could only hear it, the crackle and roar of brush breaking. The rattled drums of men who thought they were studying campfire smoke and were asked for their souls instead. The slam of orders. Too late to be called orders. Right, the right, ran along our line like a hand on a washboard. Ezra grabbed my sleeve. Fairview. Winslow. I ran through a world that had stopped pretending to be trees and had shown us it could be walls. I bled my skin on branches and day-old briars and found the battery where it had been put earlier that afternoon, a line of Napoleons with their muzzles yawning like men who had not yet had coffee. "From Blake," I said, thrusting the note forward. Captain Winslow tore it with a finger and shouted for limbers to run up, and then for cannoneers to stand to, and then for cannoneers to hold until the blue line entangled itself and learned its destination. A staff officer galloped into a stump and went over the horse's neck. It was that kind of dusk. By the time I made it back, our right and rear had learned new shapes. Refugees from the blow burst out among our trees, breathless and nameless, and then found names again in the act of joining a line where they could fit themselves as men instead of as panic. Hennessy's voice held what the field wanted us to have, steady, as if it were a ladle and he could pour it down our marrow. We drifted backward and found ground that could be held. We stood in pairs and tens, and then suddenly we were a company again. We fired into a dark that was not empty, and men came and hit that dark with their bodies because no other weapon presented itself in time. The woods lit, how can I say it otherwise? And then decided that if flame was allowed, it would be greedy. Brush burned. Smoke ate breath. A wounded man pulled down a green bough and whipped it against the ground to slap fire away from his trousers. Puck pressed his sleeve over his mouth and coughed until he found my shoulder with his free hand, and gripped it as if he were testing whether bone stayed. Bone like it had in winter. Jackson went forward where the woods heard no name, and when the moon rose a little, it found him, and his men found him, and the bullets from his own line found what they thought they needed to find. They carried him back, and the night wrote itself into a lesson. The papers would make into a song, and the surgeons would make into another line of names they didn't expect. We learned none of it then. We learned it because the shape of the enemy's voice changed slightly, just enough for a man like Hennessy to look up and say, "They've lost their tongue." I was sent to Fairview twice more before dawn. The second time, Lydia Parker found me. Not on purpose, no one could plan a path through those hours. Hennessy had brought us for water to a dip in ground, where the smoke fooled itself into thinking it had thinned. Lydia was there with a basin and bandages, and the eyes of a woman who had taught herself not to add up anything but stitches. "Drink," she said, and held a tin to my mouth. My throat took it like it had been born dry. "Your voice is wrong," she said softly, no judgment, simply the observation of a woman who has measured many aches. The basin caught lamplight, and I understood, for no reason other than that it had to be true, that she had seen my binding before any surgeon had. Her hand touched my wrist once, not by accident. "Longer shirts," she said, as if instructing a fresh volunteer how to boil a rag. "Buttons up to here." Her finger tapped above my sternum. "If you must run messages, take the shady side," she added, creating, in a handful of syllables, a sacrament of common sense that might yet save both my chest and my lungs. "Yes, ma'am," I said, careful because gratitude is sometimes loud when it means to be quiet. At dawn of May 3rd, the world threw off pretense and fought. "Hazel Grove," said a gunner, as if naming a baby. The Confederates had pulled from that little swell of ground in the night. Our guns moved in, and then were told to move again. Lee's men came back and took it as only men who love their guns can take ground, by turning it into a platform. Artillery squared off between Hazel Grove and Fairview in a duel that made smoke the new alphabet. We hugged our pits and listened to shells speak their different names: Parrot's long whistle, Napoleon's curt boom, and learned again to feel the shudder of air before the sound reached bone. It was business like killing, the kind that makes pride and grief occupy the same chair and find a way to sit without knocking each other onto the floor. Chancellor House received this business and caught fire like temper toward evening, which is to say, it took first time first, and then it took only a little more time to get worse. We moved the wounded out of its rooms as if rooms had started to hunch their shoulders. The porch railing charred while a surgeon finished a stitch and bit it off with his teeth. Hooker stood near a pillar, his face set on the outside and altered on the inside until a pillar cracked and gave the air something else to carry. Word ran faster than truth. The general was hit. By the time I got there with a message that would already have been out of date if I had flown, a staff officer waved me away on principle. "Report to your company," he said. And I learned what a general's story looks like from the distance of 3 trees. I carried another note between a rifle line and a battery, and that is when it almost happened. We were pivoting around a new center at Fairview. Men and orders flew. A surgeon shouted for all fevers and wounds not bleeding to present at the little tent by the road because he had to ration his hands. I ran past, and he snagged my sleeve with 2 fingers that may have been gentle at breakfast and were not now. "You," he said, "you will be seen." I opened my mouth to give him Ezra's note to read, and he said, after, his other hand was already on my lapel. He tugged, and the top to buttons. Gave .at that exact moment a man carried a boy, sideways into the tent, and the boys head banged the pole and the word mother left his mouth and away. That made everyone eligible to be a mother for 1 second. The surgeon spun to catch the boy's jaw and keep his teeth from closing, and I closed my jacket and found my voice and turned it into brass. "Lieutenant Blake's orders for Winslow," I said, and put the paper in the surgeon's hand as if he were my adjutant. He read it without seeing it and then shoved it back at me and said, "Then what in God's name are you doing standing here?" I left as if I had been told to, and behind me the tent flap swallowed a life I did not have a right to look in on. Puck was not at our trench when I got back. He had gone to fetch water when the lines had closed in. I looked for his hat. I looked for the way he slanted his musket when he did not think about it. I found his tin cup in a track of red sand, as if he had set it down to be polite, and intended to come back for it. I ran without telling Hennessy where my feet had decided to go. I saw him near a crash where a small pine had taken a shell that was not meant for trees. He was on his knees with both hands pressed to a thing that every man in that piece of woods could name, and none would say. "Sam," he said, before he saw me, before he knew what he was saying. "Sam," and then he laughed a little because he had used my name as a cork to keep his breath in. We had no tourniquet ready for that place. We had only a rag, and I put it where the rag would not matter, and I held his head, because that is what men should do when the rest is over. He said, "Ma'am," and I said, "I am writing," and he said, "Good," and the shelling carried on, not caring that the word was not finished. Lydia appeared like a good thought, and knelt and dipped a cloth, and laid it on his lips, and had the decency to look at me as if she knew the fullness of my name. Puck's hand found mine, and man and woman did not matter to a hand that had decided to close properly. It did. It closed. I wanted a psalm that did not accuse or brag. I could not find one. The artillery found its own, and that was enough for the hour. We fell back along a line to a place where a fence pretended to be a wall, and where a line of guns pretended to be a doctrine. The fighting at Fairview soured, then sweetened, then went bitter again. Hazel, Grove, Spat, Flame. Men counted shells by their own teeth, how they clicked when a fuse landed near. Hooker pulled us toward the river in a slow recoil that was something less than defeat and something more than a trot. By nightfall of the 3rd, the woods had done what they wanted, and the army had done what it could, and a light rain reminded us that it is possible to obey more than one master in a day. We spent the 4th under orders to hold lines near the rivers and to receive what came over from Fredericksburg, the VI Corps marching to our help. After punching Salem Church in the jaw and walking away from the swing, we were told to be grateful properly, and not to laugh at the way men's legs sometimes forget their manners when they have been used with conviction for 48 hours. Ezra found me and didn't find Puck, and then put his hand on my upper arm and gripped until it communicated. He was a good soldier, he said carefully. And in that sentence a lieutenant reads a scripture he did not write. On the 5th the army uncoupled itself from the wilderness as a man disentangles his coat from the blackberry bush. We crossed the river again where Hooker had told us the last time. The canvas pontoons remembered us and forgave nothing. We came to our old camps, made new, and slept in the dirt as if it were ours. We would remain to bury and to write and to argue and to say words about generals that winter had not taught us to say, and to fold letters into pockets where they could not be lost. If the river decided to stand up again. Among these hours, the question bullet found time for its favor. I came to a little run where men had pulled their shirts off and were rubbing them with lye and the kind of determination that ignores the cold in spring. "Sam," one of the New York boys called, "bring your wool. It's Saturday if the Lord says so." I held my jacket close and said, "The Lord didn't tell me." And there were 2 laughs and one look that was not yet a laugh. The look belonged to a boy who had watched me shave the air with a burnt match. He said nothing then. He said later, "You're careful," exactly as Puck had said. I said nothing, and then I said what had to be true. In a world where you can die for being careful and you can die for not being it, careful men live, I told him. He nodded, because it is hard to turn a proverb on its side when a man says it in the tone of someone who has earned the right to it. The days after Chancellorsville, Lydia passed by and handed me shirts from the washing tent and said, "Longer." She did not wait for thanks. Hennessy went silent for 2 whole mornings, and then returned to his ordinary faith that the order steady could be shouted and obeyed. Ezra's hair turned a tone the sun had not put in it. His voice remained linen. O'Rourke came with boards for coffins and said, "Some men become trees." He was right. Puck was one of those. I wrote to Ma'am with no last name because that is how the world had given him mother. I wrote, "He was brave," and that is a sentence anyone can put down and find it not wrong. I wrote, "He said your name the way a man should," and that is a sentence that can be read at a table without turning the coffee cold. I wrote, "He laughed when he could," and I signed the letter with a hand that made a narrow S. We told each other the story of Jackson's arm and the way the woods make mistakes of their own. We did not try to turn it into a lesson that could be learned twice. Hooker would be judged by men who never had to bind their chests in spring. Lee would be judged by men who never had to unbind a pontoon in the dark. The papers did a thing they know how to do: choose a day and name it so it stays put. Chancellorsville earned its name. It also earned us a habit of checking to see if dawn had more light in it than the night before. It did. It did. Eventually, in the weeks between spring and the next thing Hooker would choose and God would allow, the army tended to the work that grows on the edges of big battles like mushrooms after rain. We counted the men who had lost their muskets and gave them something to carry. We took back shirts that had lost the war with lye and replaced them with other shirts that would lose the war with sweat. We listened for trains that said north and took aboard men who would be healed or would be something that counted as healed at a table they recognized. We learned to sleep with our jackets closed again. We learned to set our cartridge boxes down and not hear Puck's laugh float out of the space where they had been before. I bound my chest tighter the night before we marched north. Not for fear though there was that, but for promise. I had promised myself that when the bullet came that would ask its question in full voice, I would be able to answer in a sentence that no one could misunderstand. Courage, I hoped to write on whatever form the world pushed beneath my hand. Registry Corrigem, I would say to a surgeon who had been asked to be a clerk by a day too long and a tent too small. I practiced the words in my mouth like a man rubs a coin smooth, thinking to spend it and then deciding to keep it for luck. Orders put my feet in the direction of Pennsylvania. Gettysburg, a man said, and hurt himself trying to pronounce all the syllables right. Adams County, said O'Rourke, who knew the world by barns as much as by roads. Ezra folded a map and put it in his breast pocket and patted it like it were a good dog. Hennessy looked at my canteen and at the way I wore my belt, and decided to tie nothing that the day would only untie. Lydia waved once from a washing line and did not say what she nodded, but I heard it anyway. Keep breathing. We had been asked questions in Virginia, and we had answered them as far as a man or a woman can when the trees themselves decide to lie. There would be other questions on new ground, with new names for fields that did not know they were about to be written into other men's letters. The woods had taught us that spring does not always choose flowers as first language. The roads north would teach us something else about wheat whispering and stone speaking and a place where a wall makes a man tell the truth to his own chest, for now. I wrote to Mr. Elias and put the letter where the post could find it. We have been to the wilderness, I wrote, and I have remained myself. I paused and added a line I had not known how to write before. Your daughter has kept faith with your son. Then I sealed the words inside paper the way a man tucks tinder into a tin to keep it dry. And I slept with my hand on it, because in spring a pocket can forget its obligation. The army moved out, and the trees closed behind us as if they had never been asked to host a fight. The whippoorwill sang itself again. The dogwood dimmed like coals banking themselves. We went north with our shirts buttoned higher and our belts one hole tighter, for the sake of good sense. And if at roll call in the morning, a sergeant shouted Whitaker, Samuel, and a voice answered here, that was nothing more than the country doing business with itself in the only language it had left that morning. We went north, and the air changed. The question kept pace. The ground smelled different. The letters in my pocket felt heavier like coins, like tools, like witnesses. We thought we were simply leaving a forest behind. We were not. We were taking a fire with us, and it would light wheat as easily as it had lit brush. We would stand on stone instead of under trees and learn how a wall asks a name. Only one of us would come back to tell it. I did not know which, as my boots took the next step, but I bound my chest and set my jaw, and decided to speak when spoken to. Pennsylvania air felt like clean cloth against the face after all that Virginia smoke. We came up through Immersive with dust in our teeth and nerves tight as a drumhead, and the road poured us toward a name that stuck in men's mouths the way bread sticks when you've talked too long without water. Gettysburg. From the Immersive road I saw the ridges gather like a row of knuckles hair. McPherson's Seminary and then the higher ground behind the town. Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, with a small tuft of trees that meant nothing to the map and everything to the eyes of gunners. The seminary cupola floated white over 1,000 other moving things that wanted to be accounted for. The smell of green apples drifted on a wind that did not know it would be asked to carry. Something heavier by nightfall, July, first sounded the way a man's heart sounds when he's decided what he can stand fast, then faster, then settled into a beat that, if it breaks, breaks everything. We came up as hurry could arrange it. Cavalry skirmishers fell back as if conducting a band that had arrived in the wrong order. And then the blue line of the first course formed and held along McPherson's Ridge until holding looked like a definition instead of a verb. I ran messages where Ezra sent me toward the seminary grounds and back to the Orchard Lane, toward Oak Ridge, where a brigade of men from Maine and Massachusetts and New York learned the names of fences, and back to the place where Hennessy had us count cartridges and sugar and men. By evening the town was a funnel, and she-cores blew through it and into the cup of Cemetery Hill. And someone with a voice cool as tin said, here. Then, and the army learned what here meant for 3 days. We slept on Cemetery Ridge while the wounded called below in fields that had had other business only yesterday. I lay with my face toward the clump of trees, that tuft of leaves that the gunners stared at the way a poor man stares at a loaf in a window, as if to memorize it for later. That's where it turns, O'Rourke said. The ground or the day? I asked. Yes, he said, and went to inspect a limber chest that had started to look like a beloved child. On the morning of July 2nd, we learned the logic of the place Culp's Hill on the right. Our corps in the center along Cemetery Ridge. Sykes and Little Round Top anchoring the left. If someone was wise, a man with a mustache, the newspapers would learn to draw sickles, push the Third Corps out where peaches grew and stone jutted and maps had not been consulted. Peach orchard, someone said. Salient. Someone else answered through his teeth. Wheatfield. Devil's Den. Little Round Top. The road whispered. And the ground learned to collect nouns with an appetite I have only seen in hungry men. Ezra sent me first to the peach orchard with a paper for an artillery captain, whose pieces had been slid into a corner like a chair. You move when you mean company, but company sends trouble first. Then he sent me running east to headquarters, where orders were being written faster than breath. To Caldwell, he said, with all haste. Caldwell was swinging a division down toward Stony Hill, and the Wheatfield men of the 2nd Corps who had drilled with us in winter and shared coffee and curses like brothers. I crossed behind a fence where a woman's wash hung like a small flag of innocence, and then over a pasture where a bull eyed me in a way that made me want to salute. To Wheatfield now, Ezra had said, and my feet learned a new way to be urgent. When I reached the edge of the wheatfield, the stalks were already trampled into the geometry of a bad dream. Men moved through them like fireflies, suffer from low expectations. The air tasted of powder and August, even though July still thought itself young. Caldwell's flags flashed in the brass light. New York, Pennsylvania, and then Mississippians pushed against them as if slow were a good way to be unstoppable. I found an aide and put paper in his hand, and he nodded, and you could see his lips count left, right, oblique even when he seemed still. Back to Ezra, I told my legs, and they obeyed. On the return run, the first scream of shrapnel moved across the orchard as if God had decided to make a high. Then saw the official noise of the day. Down by Trossel's place, the guns began to act out a lesson that would be recited for years. Bigelow's battery planted itself and then, told to buy time, began to retreat by prolonged rope and strength and obstinacy, pulling iron backward while iron Spitfire forward. Hold at all hazards, someone said. And a hazard is only a number until a horse screams and a wheel buckles, and a man shoves his hand under a trail, because he hasn't any other way to keep the day from rolling over him. I carried another note, this one to an aide near Stony Hill, and then I turned for the return. I did not hear the shot. I have never been able to hear the one that matters. I felt the shove in the left side, just below the fold of cloth that hid a truth no one had bought and no one had seized by force. It was not like fire. It was like air remembering. It doesn't want you. I dropped with the ridiculous precision of a person who has been taught to kneel in church, but has chosen a stone instead of a pew. The world narrowed to the rough weave of my fatigue blouse, and the way a single blade of wheat can be too alive for its own good. I swallowed a sound because I needed the air more than the complaint. Hands were on me then, one of ours, one I did not know. Up, said a voice that belongs to men who have carried their friends and are tired of it. They slid me onto a door taken from a house by men who understand that doors are tables when needed and sleds when needed, and altars when needed. Spangler, somebody said. And I knew that name because we had passed the George Spangler farm on Granite Schoolhouse Lane, and the barn there had already started to learn what it is to hold more than a harvest. They carried me past a line of men whose faces were some other country. The barn swallow dipped and rose through eaves like it refused to permit the day authority over its flight. The dressing station smelled like vinegar and blood and work. A surgeon whose name I learned later stood in the center of a circle of light as if God had drawn a target under his feet and had instructed him to get used to it. Head wounds this way, belly wounds there no. Leave him, he said, rearranging death's furniture as politely as possible. Heat and exhaustion on the porch. Arteries on the table. I was neither head nor belly. I was blood coming from a place a soldier keeps private unless regulation forbids modesty. Left side, the orderly told the surgeon, and he nodded and said nothing in the tone that sends men to heaven with dignity and to work with speed. Name? The surgeon asked, as a matter of arithmetic. Whitaker Samuel. Age? 20. Regiment? 2nd Corps, sir. He cut the blouse with a nick of the scissor near the collar. My hand went to the buttons faster than my voice found reason. Let me, I said, because any soldier says that when any surgeon forgets to say please. He looked up because it was the wrong kind of courtesy for a field. His eyes assessed, Not my name, the line had already signed me Samuel, but my manner, because a man is sometimes caught in the act of being more cautious than cowardly. He moved to the left and pressed near the wound. It will hurt, he said, and then it will hurt for a while, and then it will be something else. Lydia Parker was there, of course she was, and after that day I decided she could be put into any place where the world needed to be told to grow up. She held a basin. Her sleeves were rolled and pinned. Her wedding ring had been taken off and put on a string so it wouldn't catch on bandage. Drink, she said, and I did. Look at this and not at that, she told me, and she lifted the tin to block the view of a saw that some other man needed and that I needed not to believe in. The surgeon palpated again. Shallow, he muttered. Lucky. He reached for my blouse and in the act of making space for his work, his hand found the binding under the shirt linen tied close with a knot I had practiced in case my own fingers ever had to undo it in a hurry. He paused. When a surgeon pauses, there are two kinds. This was the human kind. His eyes rose to mine, and I let him see that I understood what he had found. The barn was full of working men and the unison of many kinds of courage. He could speak and make a nuisance, or he could speak and make a term. He did the last thing. Soldier Whitaker, he said low, as if dictating to a clerk whose paper would have to stand up under scrutiny. How do you want to be recorded? Record courage, sir, I said, because I had practiced this in my mouth for months without knowing it. Then write the name I mowed when the day is done. He pressed once against the wound to judge whether I had the breath to be gallant, and then nodded as if we had sighed the same sigh in different mornings. Very good, he said simply, and drew his knife and moved me through pain like a man steering a boat in shallow water, slow, decisive, without letting me belittle either the depth or the craft. He fetched the ball mini, flattened, nasty, and dropped it into a tin where it made the sound that evil makes when it wants to seem small. He packed and bound. No rib, no lung, he announced to someone who needed numbers to stay sane. You will keep your breath, if you own it like you did mine. The orderly leaned near the surgeon and, because decency argues with duty even in barns, whispered, Sir? The surgeon did not lift his head. You will not report what is not your business, he said, and in that sentence I loved him more fiercely than was proper. Lydia put a hand on my wrist and said, Shirts with higher collars. If there is a provost around, there's always a provost around, do not lie. Tell him you are a soldier who took a ball and came honest by it. She squeezed my hand once and added, and if he asks who dressed you, send him to me. I have a tongue. Do we write her? The orderly started and then corrected himself. His discharge? The surgeon sighed. We write his case. We write that a private was wounded at Gettysburg in honorable service. We write that he is transferred to the rear for convalescence. We do not write a single word more than that on any paper. If the army chooses to write another sentence, it will do so with the same pen and in front of the same God. Hennessy found me on a bench outside the barn where the air could still get in and do its part. He did not fuss. He did not ask stupid things. He sat. He took my canteen, drank because I had offered it without moving my lips, and set it back on the bench. You bought it honestly, he said, which is a thing that the living are allowed to tell one another in confidence. Ezra came next, his hair dusted with yellow powder from shells, and his eyes the fine worn color of a winter coat. I need you, he said, which is either the biggest compliment or the most insupportable pressure that a young officer can put on anyone. But I will do without you for a time. He looked up at the ridge as if it were a grammar and he had decided to pronounce it correctly. Rest, he said. There will be more work later. He started to go and then turned back, his face slightly rearranged by gentleness. You know that whatever the clerk writes when he has nothing else to do is not the same as what an officer writes in his book when he knows what his men have done. I nodded. He put a hand against the post and leaned, and in that act I saw the worst of his day without having to ask. Puck, I asked, because love is a compulsion. He has been reported, Ezra said softly. He didn't say where he had been reported to. I didn't need telling. And it was good of him to spare me having to nod. All afternoon the barn shook with the artillery that spoke between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge and then toward Little Round Top, Hazel Grove, and Fairview doing the arithmetic again, the left lifting and holding. Bigelow's Napoleon pealing like a bell you choose to die under if you have to. The air in the barn did what all barns are asked to do, held breath for men who had none, and gave it back without making a show of it. Lydia passed with pails and cups and stitches, and something quieter than any of those. The wounded with belly wounds moaned in a language that everyone understood and no one could answer. The head wounded spoke of chimneys and stoves, and girls with dark hair, and boys who had learned to milk cows. And that language, too, needed no dictionary. Toward evening, a story ran through like a stray dog. A battery near the Trossel place had backed out of hell and drawn a line on the grass with its wheels that would not go away in a mind, even if the rain insisted. Bigelow, men said. Another story settled in behind that one. Men on Little Round Top had run out of patience with the usual, and had taken to steel because there were no other choices left that would serve. Chamberlain, men said. Bayonets, other men answered. And an officer wrapped a thread around a man's arm and asked for a prayer that did not have to do with any one regimental name. I doze because sleep claimed me like a mother with a child who keeps insisting he needs water. When I woke, the light had turned that deep barley color that makes a barn seem full even when the loft is bare. A chaplain came through with a prayer book and a face that had learned how to look at needles without flinching. He asked if I wanted words. I want bread, someone else said. The chaplain produced a hardtack and then said the Lord's Prayer anyway. It was not disrespect. He understood that both requests were moral. By nightfall a quiet fell, not because anyone had finished, but because the day had run out of permissible noises. Taps did not sound in so many places as a man would prefer, but a few notes drifted from the slope of Cemetery Hill and put a hand over the mouths of the FLIs. I thought, not of Puck, because that was a tear I had already placed on the shelf I reserve for things I cannot put down, but of my father's table, of my mother's picture rolled in a square of calico in my haversack, of the way my father's handwriting looked like fences doing the right thing in a flood. Mr. Elias, I whispered, because at that moment to call him Pa would have heaved my ribs up in a way that would have reopened something we had paid money and nerve to close. I am still myself. I put a hand against the bandage to feel the truth of the lie and the lie of the truth. On the morning of July 3rd we were ready to believe that nothing else remarkable could be asked of us. Then the air convinced us otherwise. It gathered and thickened, and then the first salvo announced itself across the ridges as if an orchestra had made cannoneers into first chairs. For nearly 2 hours the world learned what it means to be an audience of unwilling men. The barn shuddered. The rafters threw dust down like they had been waiting to do it. A lantern chimed because iron shook it, and the man near it put his hand to it, not to save its light, but to stop its social arrogance. They're going to come, someone said. Where? There, a gunner said, pointing his chin toward the clump of trees behind which the rock bent into a friendly angle and a low wall promised to act as a policy, not a mere decoration. I could not go. Even if Ezra had been wrong in his kindness, Lydia would have forbidden any notion that I had another morning to spend outdoors. From my place on the bench I felt the ground do the thing that men's feet do when a large body moves deliberately in one direction. I heard the whoop of command and the softer, opposite howling of men who have been told to do something that isn't natural but has been made customary. Then I heard the long tearing noise that pride makes when it meets stone. Picket, someone said, and an iron smell sat down beside me in my throat even though I was not in the line. The rumor came backward like a stream that has found a wall and cannot help going sideways. Some men had reached the wall. Some had come over. Some had put hats on sword points. Some had been returned to the fields. A man named Cushing had spurred his gun forward where it had no business being. A general with a good face, Hancock, had put himself in the air like a prayer. They held, men said. We held. I allowed myself, even though that day I had held only my place and my breath while the world did its part with shot and will. After, the barn filled again, and the names that the newspapers would print later were written nowhere in that room. The men there had smaller names, their children's names, their dogs' names, the names of pies and tools and corners of fields that nobody will put on a map. I learned the work of not saying anything when a groan invites conversation, the holy practice of simply putting your palm down on a forearm and leaving it. Lydia taught me inches that day where a knot must be tied nothing less than 4 fingers from a wound, where a bandage must be slit to relieve a swelling that wants to make a liar out of every brave sentence in the barn. The surgeon handed me a roll of lint and said, "You have done this before. I have watched you long enough to think the watching counts," I answered. And he grunted, which, in a field barn, is a letter of recommendation. Toward evening Ezra found me with a folded paper. Hennessy stood behind him with his hands clasped in a way that made his steel look like it had been warmed and made useful for cutting bread instead of anything harder. "You will be transferred to the rear with the wounded," Ezra read softly. "You will await further orders from the corps surgeon. Your service is held to be honorable. He let the paper drop to his side and added, I wrote the last sentence. Hennessy reached and took my hand where it lay beside me and squeezed it as if he were checking whether a post had been set deep enough. Private Whitaker, he said, as publicly as a bench and a dusk allow, stood in his place in all weather. He paused, then, deciding honesty did no harm in the presence of affection. And in more weathers than the army provides, will they? I asked, not finishing anything, because finishing is the privilege of men who have already had certain things taken away. They will do what they think is tidy, Ezra said. We will do what is right. Lydia stepped into the light of that sentence with a basin and a roll of cloth like she had been summoned by grammar. Make room, she instructed Hennessy without trouble. And he obeyed her with the only dignity a man has when a woman issues good orders. That night, before they moved me, I wrote to Mr. Elias. I am well enough to write, I put at the top, because that is the truth that keeps a man from going to ground. I have taken a ball on a field whose name you will have to look up on a map, because pride is a sin only if it is misplaced. A surgeon asked how to record it. I said courage. I ask you to record the same. I hesitated. A long time with the pencil pressed against my teeth, and then I wrote the sentence I had been saving for the day when the world would not forgive me except in the presence of a good phrase. Your daughter has kept faith with your son. It did not matter that the order of the words might trouble a clerk. The only person the sentence owed workmanship to was my father. I signed Samuel, and in a smaller hand I signed Sarah, and I folded both names into the paper and tied it with thread because when things go north in summer, they like to get loose, unless a woman has wept over them. They moved me after midnight to a farm lane where wagons bumped and did arithmetic with their wheels. The road to the rear was a procession of sentences shorter than a breath. Mind the stump. Careful. My hat. It's good. There. I saw men I had carried water to at Antietam. Men who had taken coffee from me at Falmouth. And one who had been my enemy at a fence 10 months ago and was now my neighbor on a cart and needed me to hold his wrist against the bed so it wouldn't beat too fast while the wheel decided which hole in the road to fall into. I held it. He slept. The world did not ask us our names. Down the lane from the Spangler place, the field was crowded with wagons pointed at Westminster, then Baltimore. A clerk walked along with a lantern and wrote quickly with a pen that had terrible manners. Name, he said. Whitaker Samuel. Regiment. I told him. He did not look up. Wound. Left side, he wrote. Left side. He did not say let me see. He had already seen 100 such things today and had learned the trick of making a soldier's wound into a fact on paper so he could live one more day with the profession of not being destroyed by each one. At dawn we rolled, and the wheels began to act like clocks. I did not know where the paper would go, or what office would receive it, or what clerk would frown at Samuel and at Sarah, and whether any man would take offense at the idea of a private who had paid his debt in kind with service. I knew this. I had worn wool in heat. I had carried coffee and cartridges in weather that never asked me nicely. I had done what Ezra and Hennessy and the line had asked of me. The bullet had asked another question, and I had answered it without lying. If you measure lying in the currency God accepts, there would be talk, there is always talk. There would be a form, there is always a form. There would be winter somewhere in my bones where I had not invited it. But I had said record courage, and a surgeon had said very good, and Lydia had said longer shirts, and Hennessy had said steady, and Ezra had said, I will do without you for a time, which is equal parts love and command. And the rest would be work or sin, depending on who undertook it. As we left the field, a bugle tried taps and missed a note, my favorite thing in music. Perfection is not the point. The point is that dignity does its job even when a man's lip is tired. The cart jolted. I put my palm over the bandage the way a man puts his hand on a letter to keep the wind off. The ridge was behind us. The work was among us. The name was mine. The rest was a slow, honorable taking apart and putting back together that a nurse does and a woman knows and a soldier finally learns to accept. They say the third day is the day when endings declare themselves. For me, the declaration was not an end, but a sentence. Register courage, then write the name I mowed. We rolled toward the rear, while the ridges held their ground for the army, and the army held its ground for the country, and the country did not yet know how much of itself had been spent and how much had been sown. I slept with both my names under my tongue, and in the morning I intended to wake and do whatever the day told a person called by both names to do. We rolled out of Gettysburg on wheels that counted the ruts like a miser counts coins. A clerk had tied a paper to my blouse name, regiment, nature of wound, and the words looked smaller than the thing they tried to cover. The wagons pointed toward Westminster, and beyond that to Baltimore, and beyond that to whatever a man calls rear when home is too far or too close to be said. Dawn found our train like a hand finds a shoulder. Dusk made our voices second-hand. Now and then Lydia's kerchief showed in the tangle, passing cups and sharp remarks like both were medicine. "Drink," she would say, and then, to a teamster, "Mind the ditch or I'll send you to the ditch to fetch your manners back." A boy with a hat too big asked if anyone had seen his brother. "He was in our company yesterday," he said, as if yesterday were still available for purchase. A man in gray, who had been my enemy for the length of a fence rail, put his palm flat to his thigh and groaned in a language that had only one noun, mother. I held a wrist when the wheel chose a hole and said nothing, which is a man's first duty with a stranger's pain. The road to Westminster was a long arithmetic problem with too many variables: axle, hill, mud, bone, patience. A woman with a basket walked the ditch and gave out pieces of bread, thin as answers, and the men who took those pieces swallowed slowly, as if it would help them understand what was happening to their lives. At the station in Westminster, commission men with ledgers and consciences guided the living into trains. It turned out that the world, when it is doing its job properly, looks like a depot, people coming and going without indignity, somebody carrying someone else's bag without needing to be thanked. We reached Baltimore under a sky that had stopped arguing. The hospital ward we were steered into had been a warehouse once brick and beams and windows meant to tell the truth. Cots lined up in rows like sermons, refusing to end early. A matron barked orders that were kindness disguised as command. "Put him there," she said. "No, not there. He will not sleep beside a window. He will sleep where I can see him." She had an iron spoon and an iron stare, and both worked. A surgeon with a neat beard and a face that did not need to pretend knowledge read my paper and did not read my body. "Left side," he said, like a person remarking on a weather vane. He pressed the bandage. I did not jump. He said good without using the word. "You will not go back to line for now," he added, as if he had always known me. His pen hovered an instant when it drifted toward the space where extra comments go. He chose not to be a clerk. "Convalescent," he wrote. "Transfer to Camp Letterman for further duty." Duty. My breath caught at the mercy of that word. There are a dozen ways to be told you are no longer wanted. Being told you are still of use is the only decent one. Camp Letterman sat on a rise northeast of town, ridgelines of tents staked into a wind that likes to carry sounds farther than sense. The big white hospital tents had floors built out of planks that had once been fences and wagons. The air was vinegar, iron, and beeswax, and I have never loved a mixture more. Men in blue and gray lay in an order that put their wounds together and left their uniform colors to be dealt with by their own eyes. The surgeons went down the rows like harvesters with consciences, deciding quickly, working clean, moving on. The Sanitary Commission women made a line of their own, boiling, folding, measuring, binding. The Christian Commission men read letters into men's ears when those men had voices but needed help turning them into words. "Here," Lydia said, handing me an apron and a job. "Boil lint. Tear cloth. Hold a man's hand with your left while you pass the doctor what he needs with your right. If you must talk, let it be about anything but the thing in his body that shouldn't be there." I took her orders, the way any good soldier takes. Orders that improve his standing with the Almighty. The first day I learned to scald bandages without letting anger boil over. The second day I learned that laudanum is a word to be measured with a thumb and not poured with a wrist. The third day I learned how to write, when a hand is shaking and the words matter more because of it. "My dear Mrs. Allen," I wrote, at the dictation of a North Carolinian whose arm had meant something until yesterday. "Thomas passed in his sleep this morning. He said your name as if it were a warm thing. He did not die for a cause you or I can name in a letter. He died a man who had done his work. I signed it for him, and he touched the ink before it dried, as if to make certain he had been part of the sentence. A clerk from the provost's office came with a book he was too young to be the master of. "We should record particulars," he said to a surgeon who had cut 3 men free of lead and kept all of them on speaking terms with their hearts. The surgeon looked at me and then at the boy and said, "Record that men were wounded here. Record that they were treated with respect. Choose your ink for the rest. And then he put his hand on my shoulder and guided me down the line to a cot where a man from upstate New York had decided to wake up after 2 days of stubbornness. I wore the apron without thinking of what it said about me. The binding under my shirt did its own job until, one afternoon, it did not. The bandage chafed a wound that had no right to hurt again. I stepped behind a canvas and loosened the knot, standing there, half helpless and half determined, caught between two truths, like a soldier between defenses. Lydia appeared, because that is what she does. She put her body between me and the world and handed me a longer strip of cloth. You will recover, she announced without ceremony. You will do it with sense. She returned to the ward, then turned her head and added, if a man asks your name, tell him. If a man asks who you are, tell him what you have done. Only fools ask beyond that in a place like this. At night, after Taps curled itself around the tent lines like a cat, I wrote letters. Some I wrote for men who breathed and simply believed paper should go out into the world wearing their words. Some I wrote for silence. Those messages I carried in my apron pocket to the chaplain, who had the sorrowful skill of finding addresses, with only a woman's first name and the county to guide him. We folded, sealed, prayed over, and sent. Once, a provost guard stuck his head in and let his eyes collect the scene, as if he had never expected the Lord to be organized. His gaze fell on me, then slid off like rain off oilcloth. He had either been briefed or blessed. He tipped his hat to Lydia, wise man, and left with a mutter. You have friends, Lydia observed. I have work, I said, and she allowed that the two are often the same. Baltimore made me useful. The city's back ways carried the newly free like streams carry fish when the dam is broken. Women with skirts that had once been flour sacks and men with coats that had once been somebody else's pride arrived in wanted numbers, and we put bowls and advice into their hands. Follow the ferry, then follow the church bells, I told one family. The father nodded as if I had given him a map. In an alley a boy showed me an enlistment broadside for the United States colored troops, and his eyes lit as if he had found a door he'd been told did not exist. Weeks later I saw him in blue tight uniform, boots like church, and he laughed when I failed to recognize him. Ma'am, he said, then flushed and said, Miss, then looked at my apron and said, practical as salt. You have done what we decided we needed to do. We shook hands as equals in the only way the day allowed. In November, I went back to Gettysburg with a wagon full of folded sheets and folded names. The ground had forgiven what it could and held the rest. They set a platform in the new cemetery and called the town to witness the dedication. I stood far off beyond the crowd, because we had tired bodies in the wagons, and a man who had not remembered to be born yet needed holding down through a chill. A silver-haired gentleman spoke for 2 hours, admirable words in admirable order. Then a tall, spare man in a stovepipe hat came forward and spoke lightly, as if he were setting a glass on a mantel. He said that the world would little note nor long remember what we say here, and I remember the day well enough to know he was wrong about that. He said that a new birth of freedom was being midwifed to us by men we could not see. I looked down at my hands and saw bandage, lint, and ink. I looked up and saw a knoll where a short tuft of trees had meant everything. It was enough. I like that the words were not longer than the breath I could manage without pain. At Camp Letterman we took down wards one by one, and learned to be smaller without being less. The Army's talk turned to other places and other letters, Chattanooga, Knoxville, the whole south end of the alphabet. I went back to Harrisburg because it was where I had learned to answer to the name Samuel, and finding the beginning of a thing is sometimes the only way to tell a story to yourself without lying. Then I went home because a man at a table in Frederick County had earned the right to hear the sentence I had decided to bring him.
My father had his hat off when I came around the side of the house with my valise that wasn't mine, and my apron folded neat so the neighbors wouldn't bother themselves. He stood in the doorway of the parlor like all fathers do who have prayer and pride in their pockets and don't know which to spend first. His hair had gone white where the world has its favored way of telling time. He set the hat down and bowed his head and said, "Daughter." And then he said, "Son," quickly, as if someone might be listening and care. I laughed because I could. Then I cried because the house made me honest. The room smelled of beeswax, tobacco, and coffee. Proper things. On the sideboard, the letter he had written in another year lay under a small stone as if it could blow off and be lost if a boy from the post office sneezed. We sat together more than we spoke. He poured coffee and put too much sugar in mine as a ridiculous sort of penance. "You brought yourself back," he said finally, and then, with an effort that moved the lines of his face into a new position, added, "And you brought him back too." He did not say which pronoun he had meant. There was only one appropriate answer. "Yes," I said. I unwrapped my wound for him, not the one under my shirt. I laid Puck's tin cup on the table between us. The metal was dented so charmingly that my father could not help himself. He put his thumb into the dent and then withdrew it as if he had overstepped a boundary at his own table. "He laughed," I said. "He did his work, and then he laughed, and then he did his work again." My father lifted the cup and set it on the mantel next to my mother's photograph. He did not ask me to bring down my Springfield. He had the sense to know what a woman keeps on the inside. "Do you aim to keep?" he asked, not finishing the sentence because he'd taught me not to finish men's questions for them. "I aim to keep what you gave me," I said. "I aim to answer to my name when it is asked. I aim to be useful." He nodded, and then, in a move that was more modern than anything else he could have attempted, he reached for my hand and held it on top of our table. "Your name is the one courage speaks," he said, and that should have been the end of the conversation. Instead, I told him of the surgeon who had been merciful with his ink, of Lydia who made industry a sacrament, of Ezra who chose what sentences to say where someone could do something with them, of Hennessy who had poured steady into our bones with a ladle. He nodded in the proper places, and then he laughed. When I told him that I had learned to scold a teamster in 2 languages, the hard one of command and the softer one of decency. I stayed a month and mended fences, because that is what Pennsylvania and Maryland people do to the world when the weather allows it. I made bread badly once and better the next time. I sat in a pew at the Methodist church and learned again that the people closest to the Lord are the ones who know where the stove is and whether the coffee needs tending. I slept in a bed that did not miss the ground under it. I did not refuse the mirror. I did not seek it. The women looked at me kindly, the men politely. Everyone had a sort of competence reserved for families that have learned to talk about the weather, because mortality is impolite to mention out loud in April.